I call Jan Logie.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I rise to take my first call on this in the committee stages of Social Security Amendment Bill number 3. The Greens are opposing this legislation because it seeks to make things just that much harder for people who are trying to get ahead through study, people on ACC who are also on a benefit, and people who are caring for family members who would otherwise be in care. To put it as simply as I can, this legislation, specifically clauses 4 and 5 and the SOP number 56, run counter to the well-being of our society as a whole. And to be honest, they come across as just mean-spirited. In this contribution, I'd like to specifically address the changes for students, and we'll hopefully get the opportunity later to address other concerns, with Mr Chair's permission. So this legislation closes a loophole that enables students who are currently eligible for a student allowance but choose not to apply for it because the accommodation supplement will offer them a higher income. This legislation will remove that option and prevent them from applying for the accommodation supplement. So it will prevent them accessing a higher income. The Green Party wants a well-educated and a well-paid society. And we believe that it's up to us collectively to support students, especially students without much in the way of financial resources. This is pretty essential when it comes to that concept of social mobility. And if we're serious about addressing our crisis of inequality, we need to be doing a lot more, not less, to support people on lower incomes to get through tertiary education, to get higher qualifications, to be able to get ahead in life. The adequacy of student support, we're told, is separate to the accommodation allowance because that has a different purpose. We've heard that just now from the Minister. To me, that seems a pretty arbitrary distinction and strange packaging of policy parameters. The accommodation allowance is available to some low-income workers, and it's available to those who are out of paid employment and on a benefit. Why exclude people in the same or even greater financial stress just because they're trying to get ahead through tertiary education? I've heard the policy rationale is, well, that's a different issue. I don't see why that's a different issue. If our concern is our population and the well-being of people as a whole. And we've had advice from NZUSA, who have told us a bit about the situation for students in New Zealand at the moment, and they estimate that as many as 1 in 6 students would be better off turning down the student allowance and applying for the accommodation supplement instead. And this is because their allowance has been abated due to parental income, and the support available for the accommodation supplement is so much better than support targeted to students. And again, students who are trying to get ahead, who are trying to gain more knowledge to be able to contribute to our society. And if you live in Auckland, and a low income and pay the average student rent of $220 a week, then you'd be entitled to $118 a week in the accommodation supplement. Now, NZUSA's survey of students' income and expenditure in 2014 showed that almost a quarter of Auckland students currently getting an allowance receive less than that due to the abatement regime. And it needs to be pointed out again, these aren't privileged people, because if you're privileged and you come from a family with a lot of financial resources, you don't get anywhere near a student allowance. So we are talking about the group of people who are coming along, who are wanting to get ahead, whose parents don't have the resources to be able to support them through. And here we are in this piece of legislation saying, well, there was an option where you could support yourself a little bit better, Mr. Chair, to get ahead. And we're going to take that away. We're going to remove that option and restrict you to an even meaner existence, make it harder to be able to feed yourself and to get to course, to be able to pay your rent. To me, that's not good policy. And the NZUSA also raised, I thought, a really interesting point of saying that this legislation the need to close this legislation came to the government's attention over 4 years ago, which means that there's been the potential for those people to access a higher level of entitlement for 4 years. But they were questioning how many of those students had been informed of that option, because the number of students in 2010, when this legislation was first introduced, who were taking advantage of the so-called loophole was only 2. And if there aren't that many students who have managed to find out about this loophole, to be able to be told about the option, then actually if we have a system of entitlements, there's something wrong with our system again, if the department was aware of it and they weren't informing them. And I would just like to point out too that students receiving the allowance who by definition are unable to support themselves and whose parents are not in a position to support them, even ignoring the levels of parental income currently part of the regime of means testing, that it takes place until students are 24 years of age, which to me is ludicrous when you think of youth development processes, but that they can get a maximum of $40 a week accommodation assistance, called the accommodation benefit. And you think of that in Auckland, when the average student rent is $220. That's a maximum of $40 for the people that we're really wanting to help get ahead, the people whose families really want their kids to be better off than they were. And you know, I've said recently in this House that we need to be acknowledging this, that actually we're being told that this is the first generation post-colonisation where our young people are likely to be worse off than their parents. And here we are, that very group that's trying to fight against the odds to get ahead, to be able to push ahead from their parents, and we're taking away options from them to be able to support themselves through that process. I've said it seems mean-spirited. It runs counter to our concept of collective good, and the Greens will certainly not be supporting this, and would hope that the government would see and listen to the arguments on this side of the House around our collective good and supporting mobility of young people, and change their minds on this point.
I call Ron Mark.
Mr. Chair, and